Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 182, and I am the show's host, Kyle. On today's show, I'm going to be discussing a new authorization for use of military force that was proposed in the Senate. This is an idea that has been kicked around for the long time, proposing a new AUMF that would be more reflective of the war on terror that America is fighting today. And now that we actually have the text of it, I could go through the text and explain to everybody what this authorizes and then, give some analysis on what President Trump may do with it. The show can be found at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and at libertarianinstitute.org. Alright, so what we're talking about here today is an authorization for use of military force, or AUMF, which is basically what America uses now as a declaration of war. I mean, this is the Congress authorizing the president to take certain action under the War Powers Act. This bill has bipartisan support. The first 5 co-sponsors are Tim Kaine, who was Hillary Clinton's running mate, anti-Trumper Jeff Flake, and then you also have Senators Kuhn, Young from Indiana, and Nelson having co-sponsored and been on board with this bill. So you have some pretty heavy hitters in the Senate on board with this bill, which means it's definitely going to see the light of day in the Senate. Now, whether it could pass or not may be a different thing. I think a lot of it will be how the media ends up covering it and how they spin the different ambiguous points of the bill. But what's important is that this legislation would replace both the 2001 and 2002 AUMF. The 2001 AUMF is the one that was passed in the wake of 9/11 just a couple days after and authorized the United States of America to go after al-Qaeda and those who America claimed at the time protected al-Qaeda, which was the Taliban. The 2002 AUMF was the one that authorized America to go after the Saddam regime in Iraq. The introduction of the legislation for this AUMF says that it allows the military to use force against the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and then designated associated forces. And as we move through the legislation, we'll get the definition of designated associated forces. Now, from the introduction, it seems a little bit more limited. I mean, al-Qaeda itself, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and al-Qaeda in Iraq, or al-Nusra in Syria, isn't necessarily a super expansive group. It geographically limits ISIS to Iraq and Syria and then mentions the Taliban, presumably in Afghanistan. So this is a relatively limited, list and authorization if you just go by the intro. But let's get into the bill. Section 2 of the bill, and then this is point 1, is that it authorizes the president to defeat the Taliban, al-Qaeda, ISIS, and this time it does not limit ISIS geographically. This is important because there's ISIS affiliate groups like the one that took control of the city in Marari, the Philippines. You have ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan. You have an ISIS affiliate in Yemen. You have an ISIS affiliate in Somalia and in Libya as well. There's also one that operates in the Sinai of Egypt. And so by, either having that designation that this is geographically located to Iraq and Syria or not, definitely sways on how many countries the United States could use military force against with or without that designation. Now, from just reading the bill and my interpretation of what I know about American legislation, it would be the actual section and coded law here and not the introduction that I'm guessing would be interpreted. And then it says here too, the designated associated forces. Section 2, number 2, part A says that it provides, I would assume, the president with uninterrupted authority to use all necessary and appropriate force against these groups. Now, the word necessary and appropriate are very elastic terms, and, this could be anywhere from providing a local group with arms and training to go out and fight the Islamic State group, using drones and targeted strikes, to using MOABs like we did in Afghanistan. And so this really doesn't seem to provide any kind of oversight as to what exactly we're allowing the president to do. Nowhere in this bill are there any caps on troop numbers or anything like that. And it just, from my understanding, would give the president blanket source. As long as he has funding, he could put, as many troops or use whatever military capabilities he wants to fight any of these wars. It's also worth talking about that there's really no definition as to what the exact mission is. it says to defeat these groups, but we're typically talking about an ideology here. This is the ideology that there are people out there, the jihadist types who want either for religious world Islam reasons or because they're like Osama bin Laden and believe that the Americans are guilty of crimes against the Muslim world and want to take revenge in a lethal way against the Americans. And so that might not be something that you could defeat. It's, a way of thinking. And so long as people out there think that way, then you're going to constantly be at war. Now, this doesn't say that they give them authorization to use military force in the case that there's an imminent threat against the United States of America. That would seem to me to be something a little bit more defined that you could actually measure and look at. Now, in Section 2, Part 2, they also claim that there's an establishment of congressional oversight. I mean, within the War Powers Act itself, there's outlines for congressional oversight that the president is supposed to provide Congress, and it's not enforced now. And so I don't think there's any reason to think or to even really waste your time getting into what the congressional oversight will be. Just because the president doesn't follow it, the Congress never raises a stink over it. And if anybody does, the establishment, majority leaders, whatever party it is, whether it's Paul Ryan or Nancy Pelosi, are going to shoot down that legislation. They also say they're going to allow for regular congressional review and debate. And here we could get into Section 4, Part A. This section of the bill lays out that on January 20th, 2022, the president will have to submit a report to Congress on the military force used under this authorization, and then the Congress will have 60 days to bring up an expedited resolution to either amend or repeal the AUMF, and if it's not done within that time, then the AUMF continues, and then this process will be repeated every 4 years. Now, the first issue and the biggest issue with this, of course, is that if Congress does nothing, then it continues. It's not that Congress has to reauthorize that. I think that's what you would be looking for, if you really want to have congressional oversight over this legislation. Because we see all the time how Congress gets tied up in some kind of big scandal. Imagine if there's impeachment trials or proceedings going on against Trump at this time, or if Congress has set up a sequester, a doomsday machine for themselves, and then they're scrambling for 2 months to try to save themselves from doomsday, or, debt ceilings and all this kind of stuff that Congress has that they set up for themselves that down the road cause a mad scramble. Then something like this that just continues if it's not reauthorized could very easily kind of fly under the radar and be reauthorized without anybody even noticing. And that's definitely not the way that you want to wage a war. This is another one of the things that was talked about in the Leah Mosh committee, and I spent an episode of my show on this committee hearing, so I'm going to go ahead and link to that show in the show notes page. But one of the experts on AUMFs was there, and she was explaining, and Daniel L. Davis and Michael McPherson of Veterans for Peace talked about this as well. That's very important to have a sunset date on these bills that will force Congress to debate it. In this way, Congress can't shirk their duties, because there's kind of a perception about American foreign policy, and that if America does nothing, you're 100% responsible for everything that happened. And this is mostly the Republicans' fault for what they did to Obama when he was forced to withdraw U.S. forces from Iraq. They then said anything that happened after that was Obama's fault, including the rise of ISIS, which was absolutely untrue, was all Bush's fault from before, and Obama should have stood up and said that. But so very disappointing. Also, 4 years is a long gap. I mean, you would think you would want that to be shorter, hopefully no more than a year, especially when you're looking at groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda who could rise very quickly and be defeated very quickly. I mean, if you look at what happened to al-Qaeda after 9/11, it was by mid-December of 2001. 200 or so were killed. Most of the rest were either in hiding or captured and sent over to Gitmo or another one of America's tortured sites. And so these terrorist organizations, if you really want to carry out an effective campaign against them, could be squashed rather quickly. And like I said, 4 years just doesn't seem like the time period you would want for that. In Section 5, we get into what these associated forces are. In point 1 of Section 5, it outlines the existing associated forces. And so a little bit deceiving in the intro in the early part of this legislation, it only lists these 3 or 4 groups, but actually there's an additional, I believe, 6 here. The first is al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, so that's the al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen. The second is al-Shabaab, which is a regional insurgency force in southern Somalia. While they swear loyal to al-Qaeda and do carry out terrorist attacks and suicide bombings This isn't a group that has shown global jihad ambitions and is mostly, I think, just looking to take portions of southern Somalia, maybe including the capital, Mogadishu. But the United States fights against them in Somalia already. The next one is al-Qaeda in Syria, which they list as al-Nusra. It's interesting that they don't list the Free Syrian Army, which was backed by the United States, or Anwar al-Sham, or the Army of Islam, all these groups backed by the United States and their allies in Syria, of course. It's also interesting with this legislation, al-Qaeda in Syria is just a good example that they changed their name. And I think these groups have found that, changing their names is a way to, stave off some bad press and such like that. And so what happens when you have, you're attacking a group, these people with this name, and then they change their name. The next one is the Haqqani Network, which is just a network of insurgent fighters in Afghanistan that I think are in part of the Taliban. And the last one they lay out is al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate that exists in really West Africa and most of it, Mali, Libya, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso. I think I got all the countries that this group operates in. And so already we're seeing that this is a pretty expansive group of, list of countries that the United States has authorized bombing here. Now, point 2 in section 5 is that after 30 days of this pass, the president could add any groups or names that he believes should be listed as associated forces. And so just, noticing some of the groups that were left off, like ISIS-K, the ISIS affiliate in Somalia and the ISIS affiliate in Libya, maybe these are groups that the president would go ahead and list. Now, point 3 says that at any time the president can add a new associated force to this list. The only thing is that they have to notify Congress within 48 hours of adding that group to the list. And then within the next 60 days, I guess a congressman could bring up a motion to vote on modifying the AUMF, but it can't touch any of the AUMF's original language. So let's say 3 years from now, Trump wants to put an Islamic State group that now exists in Nigeria on the list. And he goes to Congress and notifies them that, hey, I put this group on the list. Now, Senator Rand Paul could then propose to take that group off of the list, but I don't think he would be able to go back and change any of the other groups that are already on the list, and certainly not any of the original groups that I've already mentioned. Section 5B lays out the geography. Similar to adding a new associated force, if the president decides to bomb in a new country, he must notify Congress within 48 hours, and they have 30 days to act on that. The countries that the authorization authorizes the president to use force in are Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Libya, and Yemen. A couple things that aren't clear here would be, how do you react when you have a country like Somalia where you have ISIS operating in that area and al-Shabaab operating in that area? Now, this bill says that the president is authorized to use force against al-Shabaab and they're authorized to operate in Somalia. Does that mean they could also attack ISIS? This gets a little bit more into play when you look at countries like Syria. So 2 groups that are authorized for the United States to fight in this bill, and then some Syria itself are listed. However, Assad is not listed and is not an affiliate and is actually fighting against all the jihadist type groups that are listed in this bill. And so this would seem to me to explicitly not authorize strikes against Assad or any other government. In fact, it does say that an associated force cannot be another sovereign state. So they can never say that Iran is an ally of al-Qaeda and therefore this authorizes the United States to attack Iran. Section 6 of this, and this is the last section of the bill I'm going to talk about, just defines that this repeals the 2001 AUMF but does not interrupt any forces that are currently deployed or, a military engagement the United States is already involved in. And again, this could be kind of awkward to figure out because you have the United States having bombed the Chinese Uyghurs, who are occupying a portion of eastern Afghanistan and who are clearly not listed as any group on this list. And so since the United States is already doing it, it would seem maybe that this bill actually does authorize the United States to continue a military action that's already using under the 2001 AUMF justification, so that's not real clear as well. Overall, I want to mention one positive with the bill is that it does not explicitly mention the Houthis or Hezbollah in any way. That was something I was concerned about with a new AUMF, is that they would go and, try to list the Houthis or Hezbollah on there to authorize either a war in Yemen or a war in Lebanon. But this does seem to authorize very expansive war and really allow the president to continue to expand that war without Congress having to ever vote on it, and that their inaction is enough for the president to continue to expand the war. So as you look and the United States starts blowing up countries in West Africa, and the Islamic Merlot group or the ISIS affiliate in West Africa starts to spread out into Nigeria and other countries in Central and South Africa, many of whom who are already destabilized for regional and colonial issues that, have caused instability in those countries. The president could just add these groups to the list. And so long as Congress doesn't step up and say, no, you cannot, and, then you got to get majority of senators to do so as well. Then I think this is almost authorizing unlimited war, at least against any group actor around the world. This doesn't limit or prevent the United States government from adding a Houthis or Hezbollah to the list. And so in that way, this legislation is very frightening. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of very good people in the Senate looking to fight against this. I could think of Ron Wyden and Rand Paul as probably being the first two that will come to mind. But who knows? That's the bill. Hopefully I've given you some ammunition to talk about this when it comes up in conversation. You could explain to people why this is a really bad thing. And, if you're talking to somebody on the left, say, what are these people insane? They're going to give Donald Trump all this ridiculous power to carry out war across Africa and Asia? This seems insane to me. We know the value that Donald Trump places on these people's lives isn't very high. And so you think he's going to be a responsible actor who is only looking out for the best interests of people and couldn't be swayed or just uninterested enough in the subject that he really doesn't care what happens to these people and authorizes airstrikes or wars against groups that really aren't terrorists? And then also you always had to worry that, they really expand on the power. It's never like the president's interpreting the 2001 AUMF saying, well, the Taliban were really defeated in 2002 and al-Qaeda was defeated in Afghanistan in 2001. So that AUMF expired. And if I want to go to war against a group named al-Qaeda or the Taliban, I have to seek a new authorization from the Congress. No, they say, by 3 degrees of separation, the Islamists that are currently occupying Libya are al-Qaeda, and then we're going to use that authorization for Central Asia to go bomb North Africa. It's absolutely insane. And the last thing is that this was obviously written to authorize the wars America is already in. This in no way limits what the president is already doing, and explicitly says so in the bill. And so when people try, say and conservatives you're talking to, talk about the endless war that we're in and how terrible this is, and that this is basically authorizing more endless war. This doesn't check anything the government is doing, whether it's Obama's war in Syria, Yemen, or Libya, or Bush's war in Iraq or Afghanistan. All right, a few things I want to update about Syria. First of all, I want to make a correction from the last show. The OPCW had planned to inspect Douma on Saturday the 14th. And I had incorrectly said on that show that inspection had happened. That inspection has not happened, and I believe still hasn't happened until now. Now, the Western countries are saying that Russia and Syria are preventing the OPCW from going and visiting this site. However, Russia and Syria are saying that the OPCW is welcome to go in, and they're just waiting on UN authorization to do so. Now, a little bit seems to me like it's probably the UN situation, not the Russia and Syria situation, because a group of journalists, including a CBS reporter and Robert Fisk of The Independent, were able to go and visit the site. In fact, I want to talk a little bit about Robert Fisk's visit. He says that he talked to some doctors and residents of Douma and found that none of them were able to report that there was actually a chemical weapons attack, and that what seems to have happened is that it was a very windy day on, I guess that would be April 7th, the day the alleged chemical weapons attack, and Assad's strikes caused a lot of dust to get into the air. Now remember, this has been a war zone for several years, so it would make sense to me if there's a lot of dust in this area from all the destruction, destroyed buildings. And then as the people ran to the hospital to get, oxygen because there was so much dust in the air, it was hard to breathe. Somebody started yelling, it's chemical weapons, it's chemical weapons. And then this is essentially spiraled into hysteria and people start getting treatment for chemical weapons. And so I'm not saying that this is absolutely what happened, that this is the narrative. I'll link to in the show notes page so you can read Robert Fisk's write-up and evaluate it for yourself. However, this, at least at this point, to me seems like a much more plausible explanation than Assad gassed his own people. Now, on the last show, one of the details that me and Will discussed about that was still left unanswered was, how many missiles was the Assad government actually able to shoot down and how many targets were there? It seems from evidence, that definitely suggests that some of the U.S. missiles were shot down. Now, Moon of Alabama is saying that number might have been in the high 60s, actually, and that the United States may actually have more targets on their list as well, and that the missiles that hit their targets were, sites that weren't necessarily under protection of missile defense system. And so, this is a very interesting theory, and as we try to piece together and figure out what's going on, because obviously we can't count on the governments, whether it be the United States or Russia, to be honest. Again, I'll link to this right up in the show notes page so all of you can read it and evaluate for yourself. On April 16th, we had Israel carrying out an attack on Assad targets. It's alleged that 9 missiles were fired and all 9 of them intercepted. I've also seen reports that either the T4 air base was hit or the Al-Sharat, I believe is how it's pronounced, air base was hit in Homs. Other reports say that that's not the case. And there's some reports saying that all the governments involved again deny it. There were also reports of explosions in the Golan Heights, but I have been unable to confirm that. At least for now, it seems that, this isn't going to heighten tensions evermore and everybody's just kind of moving past it already, and that at least no major damage was done to the Assad government or Iranian targets within Syria. I want to talk about a new Trump and Bolton plan to create an Arab force to replace U.S. troops in eastern Syria. The Arab force that's floated would have troops from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, and Qatar. Of course, there are tons of problems with this proposal, the first of which is that a lot of these countries have more on their plate than they can handle already. If you look at Egypt, their western border has been completely destabilized, and it's a pretty big border, thanks to Obama and Hillary's war against Gaddafi. And they also have a large ISIS and jihadist and militant presence that's running around the Sinai Peninsula. That country's also seen a lot of destabilization over the recent years. However, they could look to, they're always looking, especially al-Sisi, to gain favor of the Americans. So Egypt could deploy forces, but it's been a long time, I believe since 1990 or 1991, that Egypt has deployed forces outside of its own borders. Saudi Arabia, of course, has its hands full on all it could handle, trying to fight a war in Yemen, and in fact has Pakistani troops deployed to their own southern border. The Emiratis, like the Saudis, are very involved in the war in Yemen, and I'm not sure how interested the Emiratis would be in going into Syria. Of course, if you look at Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, these are groups and these are countries that actually backed the jihadist factions within Syria during, really the times when al-Nusra and ISIS were on the rise. And so it should really, be a problem that these are the countries that we're looking to back again. And of course, Qatar and the rest of the GCC are still split. I read reports that Saudi Arabia floated the idea of turning Qatar from a peninsula to an island. And so it seems unlikely to me that you would be able to rope this coalition together. And it's kind of an idealistic idea from likely John Bolton. Last thing I want to say, I read a report today that says Israeli intelligence said that the United States attack on Assad did not accomplish the mission of degrading Assad's chemical weapons capabilities. I gotta imagine this is gonna be the kind of thing that really upsets Donald Trump. And we'll see what the fallout is here. I have no idea. Israel seems to be a little bit more belligerent in Syria as of late, especially with the attacks on Assad on the 8th, the day following the chemical weapons attack. That seemed to be a very brazen attack and a very high-profile attack from Israel. I just want to update last Friday's protests in Gaza. Of course, another absolute bloodbath. Only one Gazan died, at least at the time I read the report, of injuries from gunshots, but hundreds were shot and over 1,000 people overall were either, sickened with tear gas or injured by live fire from the Israelis. Now, if it's not bad enough that they're, having their snipers line up and shoot people in the ankles as they march towards the gates of their prison, they're now allowing the Palestinians to enter in or to leave Gaza, I guess, and seek medical treatment at hospitals that could save their lives. In fact, 2 Gazans recently lost their lives because they were denied the right to travel to a hospital. And so I don't know what more way, it could be clear now that this is absolutely a prison that the Palestinians in Gaza are living in. They're not even allowed to leave to seek medical treatment. I think in the United States, we would be horrified if a prisoner was treated this way. Last thing before I wrap up, I read a UN report that says 8.4 million Yemeni are on the brink, a step away, I think is the language they use, from starvation. And so, if there's a way to possibly, end the war in Yemen, look for the rallies out there or the, different congressional moves to try to end that war, but something needs to happen or a lot of people are going to starve to death. All right, that's where I'll wrap up the show. I've noticed I have a lot of new listeners lately. So first of all, thank you to all my regular listeners, especially those of you who are taking the time to share the show. It's definitely making a difference. But I do a show every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Usually my shows run from 20 minutes to a half hour. I know quite a few of the more recent shows have been longer, just with the hot topic of Syria and having Will Porter on the show. The show can be found at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. Facebook, the group is Foreign Policy Focus. The page is Libertarian Union. I'm on Minds at Immersion News. My brand new awesome website is immersionnews.com, which all of you should definitely check out. YouTube and BitChute are at Immersion News. I think that's about all I got.